Mrs. McPhee slowed down as she looked for a good place to stop the old car. But the young man in the fast sports car behind her didn't slow down until it was too late. The sports car hit the back of Mrs. McPhee's car. Both cars then came to a stop at the side of the road. Emilio was lucky. His seatbelt kept him safe. He looked at Mrs. McPhee. She was still wearing her seatbelt, but her eyes were closed. Emilio didn't know what to do. At first he felt angry like he did when he was at school. How could something this bad happen? Why now? But he knew he mustn't get angry. He must do something. But what? He got out of Mrs. McPhee's car and looked at the sports car. He saw that the driver was not much older than him. There was blood on the driver's face, and his eyes were closed. Emilio knew he must get help. Mrs. McPhee didn't have a mobile phone. She didn't like them. Did the young man have a phone with him? He looked. Yes, there was a phone on the floor of the sports car, but it was broken. At first, Emilio thought of waiting for another car to come and stopping it. But the road was quiet, and not many cars used it. It could be a long time before a car came, and he didn't have time. No, he must do something himself. The rain stopped. Emilio thought hard. Perhaps he could drive one of the cars. The sports car was no good, but Mrs. McPhee's car looked okay. Maybe he could take the young man and Mrs. McPhee to the pottery studio in it. Grover Jackson could get help for them then. Emilio looked carefully at Mrs. McPhee's car. One of the back tires was no good. The other tires looked okay. He didn't know how badly hurt the sports car driver and Mrs. McPhee were. He must get them to Grover's studio. But how? He needed one more wheel, but there wasn't one. He felt his anger again. Then Mrs. McPhee's voice spoke to him inside his head. You must see it in your head, just like it was in front of you. Then, in a very careful way, you make it with your hands. Of course! All his anger was gone. He knew what to do. When Grover Jackson saw young Emilio Lopez driving Mrs. McPhee's car up to the pottery studio, he knew something was wrong. He called for help right away. 15 minutes later, Grover and Emilio were talking to two policemen. Mrs. McPhee was getting into an ambulance. The young man from the sports car was all right, thanks to Emilio. The police all said that Emilio was a fine young man. Emilio was trying to tell them what happened. They were asking him a lot of questions. One of the policemen said that you could not drive Mrs. McPhee's car with only 3 wheels. But Grover was sure he saw 4 wheels on the car when it arrived. The policeman said, "I'm sorry, sir, but there are only 3 wheels on the car." But Grover just knew he saw 4 wheels on the car. Yet, when he looked again, he saw only 3 wheels. Why was that? What happened? Could Emilio tell him where the 4th wheel came from? Where was it now? "Hey!" Mrs. McPhee shouted from the ambulance. She was fine, but she wasn't going anywhere without seeing Emilio first. She told the police that the hospital could wait a little longer for her. Emilio wasn't the kind of boy to put his arms around people he liked. He just gave a big smile when he saw her. The smile told Mrs. McPhee all she needed to know. Grover put his arms around her and laughed. Grover told Mrs. McPhee about the 4th wheel. She looked very interested, but said nothing. Then Grover asked Emilio about the wheel. Emilio answered by putting his hand on his pocket. Emilio knew the car needed another wheel. Then he remembered Mrs. McPhee's drama classes. You must see it in your head just like it was in front of you. Then, in a very careful way, you make it with your hands. All it needed was for him to believe. So he made the wheel, and he did believe in it. And it did work, just like she told him. And when the job was finished, he put it back into his pocket. So Emilio spoke just 2 words to answer Grover. Grover Jackson thought he knew a lot about clay. But he didn't understand the answer Emilio gave. Emilio knew. He and Mrs. McPhee knew. They both laughed as they said the words again together, special clay. The Trishaw man. Gregory Lim was only 13 years old, but he was the best student in his class. All his teachers said he was doing very well. Singapore needs young people like him, they said. He'll go far. But Gregory wasn't very good at sport. He wasn't bad, but he wasn't good. It wasn't important, not really. He was intelligent, but he wasn't strong. Gregory's father, Thomas Lim, was strong, very strong, and he loved his son. No father could feel better about his son than Thomas did. He was always thinking about his only child. Thomas drove a trishaw, and he worked for many hours a day. He drove people around on a 3-wheeled trishaw bicycle. The bicycle pulled a seat for 2 people. It had a kind of big umbrella at the back. This went over the seat to keep the sun out of people's eyes. Thomas often had 2 or sometimes 3 people in his trishaw. They sat under the umbrella while he pulled them around in the hot sun. Sometimes taxi drivers got angry with him because the trishaw was slow. The taxi drivers also didn't like Thomas taking business away from them, but that didn't happen so often now. Years ago, people used trishaws a lot. But people these days usually wanted taxis because they were quicker. Trishaws were too slow for most people. Only tourists on holiday used them, and sometimes old people who liked to remember the old days. Thomas often had to work well into the night to make enough money to live on. Gregory's mother, Anita, liked to think of her son as she worked at a fish shop. Every time she cleaned a fish or put a kilo of prawns in a bag, she thought of her only child. She didn't mind all the hard work and the smell of the fish on her skin. It was all done for her son. The money from Anita's job at the fish shop helped to pay for Gregory's school things. Yes, it was a hard life for Thomas and Anita, and everything they did was for their son. Gregory was going to get a good job and look after them when they were old. Gregory went to school by bus. He hated it when other students arrived at school in taxis or cars. The rich students came in their father's new Mercedes or comfortable taxis. He was the best student, but it was the others who had money. That's how Gregory saw it. They were the ones with nice new clothes. They played computer games. They ate hamburgers at expensive fast food restaurants when they wanted to. And everybody knew his parents were poor. That's what Gregory hated most. They all knew his father drove a trishaw. Everybody saw his father pulling tourists around in the hot sun. Could there ever be a worse job than that? Why, driving an old taxi was better than driving a trishaw. Gregory wasn't the only one from a poor family. Many other students also had 2 working parents. But their fathers had better jobs than his father. They didn't work in the hot sun, and they wore nice clothes. They got paid every month. Gregory loved his father. He knew how hard he worked. If only his father had a different job. Gregory was an A student, but his father was a poor trishaw driver. It was all wrong. No, Gregory never forgot what his father did, but he often wanted to. Said Thomas to himself as he pulled the trishaw up a hill. There were 2 heavy tourists in the back, and the roads were full today. It was National Day, a holiday in Singapore. It was very busy, and everybody was having a party. People were out in the streets. The red and white colors of Singapore were everywhere. It was a good time for business for Thomas. Cars were slow on the busy roads. This was one of the few times that Thomas's trishaw could be quicker than a car. It was a good time to make money, but it was hard work. After all, he wasn't getting any younger. His 2 tourists wanted to see the famous Raffles Hotel. It was a favorite place for tourists. On that day, there was another visitor to the hotel, a beautiful and very famous film star called Diane Troy. She was making a film in Singapore. Diane was having a day off from filming and wanted to rest, but she had lots of fans who wanted to see her. Everybody knew Diane Troy was staying at Raffles. The street outside the hotel was very busy. People were there for National Day and also to see their favorite film star. There were hundreds of people all around the front of the hotel. They all wanted to see Diane Troy. The fans were happy, but after a time they felt uncomfortable. The sun was hot, and it wasn't easy for people to move. There were just too many people there. All the taxis coming to the hotel moved slowly because of the crowd. It was still early in the afternoon. The day was at its hottest. Thomas could get to the hotel quite quickly. He knew his way around Singapore better than almost anybody. He knew all the shortest ways that cars were too big to use. And it was easier for a trishaw to move through lots of people. Cars were much slower. Thomas always called out in a loud voice to let people know he was coming. The trishaw stopped outside Raffles Hotel and the 2 tourists got out. They wanted to see Diane Troy, too. There were cameras everywhere, and so many people. The 2 tourists took out their cameras and Thomas said goodbye. He was about to go when Diane Troy came to the window. Everybody pushed to the front to get a better look. All the people were very close together. Diane Troy smiled and waved to the fans, and they shouted back. Then Thomas saw something at the front of the crowd. A woman was calling loudly for help. But why? Then he saw why. The woman was trying to stop a young girl from falling. It wasn't easy with all those people around them. The girl was about 12 years old. Both the woman and the girl looked like tourists. "My daughter!" the woman shouted. "A hornet stung her. Please help me. She needs a doctor quickly." There were shouts from the people around her. They all knew that hornets in Singapore are very dangerous. Hornets can kill children or old people. Everybody is afraid when they see the big black and yellow insects, but the nearest hospital was far away. The woman couldn't walk through the streets carrying the sick child. Certainly not when the streets were as busy as this. A taxi was too slow in these crowds. But Thomas knew what to do. Gregory Lim felt very pleased. He was looking at a page from the Straits Times, Singapore's biggest newspaper. Lots of students were looking at it. The page was up on the school wall. Gregory smiled as the students read the newspaper story on the wall. That was his father they were reading about. His father, the trishaw driver. Beautiful thing. Beautiful. Very, very beautiful. Where did you find it? The professor asked. Well, I said, I didn't really find it. It found me. Professor Selkirk looked very happy, and I was feeling happy myself. I've been at university for 2 years now, I thought, and this is the first time he has said something nice to me. Okay. I know all the other students have found interesting things, but not me. I never found anything, not until now. Now I was, at last, someone he was interested in. The professor smiled at me. He had quite a nice face, really. Old, but kind. You have to be a real archaeologist to find something like this, Polly, the professor said. Polly. He usually calls me Miss Hopkins. He must really like what I've found, I thought to myself. Yes, he went on. A real archaeologist sees right away what something is. That's what we're here for. We're here to study things from the past, things we find in the earth. We can learn important things, if we know how to look. So, how did this beautiful thing find you? I looked again at the beautiful thing he had in his hands. It was round and as big as my hand. It looked like a little wheel from something, a thin silver-colored wheel. It was dirty, but you could still see its lovely silver color, like a CD. But there were lines on it. Was it writing of some sort? Maybe. It was strange, I said. I mean, I wasn't looking for anything unusual. Then all at once, it was there at my feet. I know that sounds stupid, but that's how it happened, really. That's okay, Polly. We archaeologists know what that means, don't we? The professor said. My face told him that I didn't know. It's what we call the nose. He laughed. The nose is the feeling you get when you know something is important. It doesn't look important at first, but it is. That's when you really know archaeology, when you can do that. It's really wonderful. It was nice that the professor thought I had the nose, but I knew I didn't. No, the silver disc really did come from nowhere. It was just like it decided to find me. But I couldn't say that to the professor now, not when he'd just said I had the nose. So, what do you think it is, Professor Selkirk? I asked. You know, Polly, he replied with a smile. I have no idea. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, I always thought the professor knew everything. Why didn't he say it was Roman or something? After all, he's the professor of archaeology here, not me. Is it Roman or something? I asked. I was trying to help. Well, Polly, I've never seen anything like it before. I think I'll have to ask some people to take a look at it. You know, this really is very, very beautiful. So, no Romans then. What about the lines on it? I asked. Is it some kind of writing? Maybe, he said. I'm afraid I just don't know. All I know is that it's old. It has to be. How do you know it's old? I asked again. It was unusual for me to ask so many questions. Maybe it's some kind of CD or something. Then they were making CDs about 2,000 years ago. He answered in a quiet voice. You see the earth around it, Polly? Look at the color. This disc hasn't seen the light of day for hundreds, thousands of years. Anybody can see that. This thing is older than it looks. And anyway, there's no hole in the center. And CDs all have a hole in the center, don't they? The professor asked some people to come to the university and look at the disc. They were at the university for a week. I don't know what they did to the disc, but it wasn't long before they asked me to speak to them. They wanted to ask me lots of questions. I was, after all, the person who found the disc. Professor Selkirk was in his office with two people, a man and a woman. They were older than the professor and looked important. Dr. Janet Collins and Dr. Danny Fellows are old friends of mine, the professor said. They know more about the archaeology of early Britain than anybody in the world. They want to ask you a few questions, Polly. Is that okay? They asked questions all right. They asked questions all afternoon. And not only about the disc. 3 hours of questioning later, they knew more about me than I did. They were very nice about it, and they never made me feel uncomfortable. But by the time they finished, my life was like an open book to them. Were they really just archaeologists? "Do you mind if we take some DNA from the inside of your mouth?" asked Dr. Collins in a friendly voice. "It won't hurt." DNA? It's everywhere in our bodies. It's what makes each of us different. They can find DNA in just one hair, and everybody has different DNA. "Of course not," I said. I was sure there were things that they weren't telling me. Still, I did as they asked. Why not? "It's okay, Polly," said Professor Selkirk. "They asked for my DNA too. They want DNA from all the people who have had the disc in their hands." "So where is the disc?" I asked. "I'd like to see it again." "Oh, you will, Polly," said the professor. "But we want to look at it for a little longer first." "How long?" "Just a day or two. No time at all," Dr. Fellows replied with a smile. "Then we'll talk again." I just couldn't sleep. All I could do was think about the disc. What was it? Why did it mean so much to me? I knew it was unusual for a student to find something important. But there was more to it than that. I knew that in some way, the disc wanted me, like it was calling out to me. I know it sounds stupid. After all, how can something thousands of years old speak to you? I didn't do much studying. I tried, but I couldn't do it. All I thought about was the disc, about how beautiful and strange it was. I didn't really think it was Roman. I didn't think that anybody knew anything about it. That's why the professor's friends asked me so many questions, because they didn't know much themselves. I was sure of that. 3 days later, I was having breakfast in the university cafe as usual. It was only 8:30 in the morning. There were still 30 minutes to go before my first class. It was about Roman buildings. I usually have breakfast with other students and talk to them. Today, I chose to eat alone and read a book about the Romans. I was just getting to one of the more interesting bits when there was a hand on my shoulder. At first, I thought it was one of my friends. "Sorry, can't talk. I'm reading," I said, not looking up from my book. "It's nice to see you working so hard, Miss Hopkins," said a voice I knew. But it wasn't another student. It was Dr. Fellows. Dr. Collins was with him. They both laughed. "But today you can stop for a little," said Dr. Collins. "We have some important things to talk about. But not here. Let's go to the professor's office." Professor Selkirk's office wasn't very big, and it looked a little strange. It was quite a new office, with computers and other new things. But everywhere you looked, there were things from the past next to them. And there was the professor sitting at his desk. The disc was on the desk in front of him. He smiled. But the look in his eyes told me he had something important to say. I felt hot in that small room with 3 other people. "Polly, please sit down." We all sat down, me in front of the professor's desk and the others behind it. I felt like a little girl at school again. I waited for somebody to speak. "You said the disc looked like a CD," the professor began. "Dr. Collins thinks that perhaps you're right, Polly." I didn't say anything, but my mouth opened. I closed it quickly. "You see," Dr. Collins said, "we didn't understand what the lines on the disc were at first. We looked at the disc in all kinds of ways. We looked at the earth from the disc, but we found nothing. Then last night the disc was on a desk next to a computer," said Dr. Fellows. When we turned the computer on, something very strange happened. The lines on the disk changed. We all saw it. It was almost like the disk knew about computers, like it wanted to speak to us. So, what did the disk say? I asked. See for yourself, replied the professor. He gave me the disk, and I looked at it carefully. The lines were now a picture of something. I knew what it was. I remembered it from school. It was a picture of DNA. I can see you know what it is, Dr. Fellows smiled. But this DNA, the one in the picture, is rather different. It isn't from the professor or from us. It isn't from anybody else at the university, except you. You see, Polly, this is a picture of your DNA. And what's more, Dr. Collins began. But the professor spoke before Dr. Collins could finish. Perhaps this isn't the right time. Polly has heard enough for now, don't you think? No, Professor. We have to tell her, Dr. Collins answered. And now is a good time to do it. I didn't like the sound of this. Tell me what? Dr. Fellows spoke now. You see, Polly, the DNA in the picture is yours. There's no mistake about that. But there's something else. And what's that? I asked. The DNA in the picture, your DNA, isn't from a person. It's different, Dr. Fellows said slowly. It looks like a person's DNA, but it isn't. We haven't ever seen anything like it before. Not anywhere on Earth. What are you saying? I shouted. My family are from London. Now you tell me that we're from Mars or something. Don't be stupid. We're not saying anything more for now, said Dr. Collins. Maybe the disk changed your DNA. Maybe not. We don't know. But we need you to stay with us. That's the only way we'll find an answer. Stay with you? I asked. What do you mean? Where? For how long? I mean, I have work to do. It's all right, Polly, said the professor. I've already spoken to the university. You can have all the time you need. They understand. Do they? I answered. I was feeling rather angry with them. I'm not sure I do. Are you saying I can't go home until you find answers to all this? Do I have to stay here until you can read an old CD? Of course, I didn't really think of the disc like that. But I like going home to my flat, and I like going out with my friends. I don't like being told what to do or where to go. Who are they to stop me from doing these things? That's just what we are saying, said Dr. Collins. I didn't like the way she said it. Her voice wasn't so friendly anymore. And the disc is something we don't understand yet. It could be something we've never seen before. It's not my problem, I shouted as I got up from my chair. I'm me, a student. I'm not from Mars. I'm going home now and nobody is going to stop me. And nobody tried to stop me. Not until I opened the door and found two large men there. Excuse me, I said. I tried to get past them. It was like trying to walk through a wall. I looked back at the professor. His face looked sad. Perhaps he couldn't do anything about any of this. I didn't know. So, you really do mean it? I asked, looking at the two doctors. They said nothing. You know, I don't think you two are just archaeologists. You're not, are you? We are, said Dr. Fellows, but we do other important things too. Now, I think it's best if you come along with us. I'm not usually the kind of person who gets angry easily, but this time I couldn't stop myself. I went over to the table and took the disc in my hands. I did it before anybody had time to stop me. It's all because of this little thing, I told them, so I'm taking it. They all stood up. They all told me to be careful, that there was no need to be angry. I wasn't listening to them. I'm going to walk out of that door, try to stop me, and I'll break this stupid disc in two. I didn't really know how to break it, but they didn't want me to try. The two large men at the door also looked very uncomfortable. Then the strangest thing happened. The disc in my hand sent out strong light, like a little sun. I couldn't look at it, but it wasn't hot. I closed my eyes. A second later, I opened my eyes again and looked at my hand. My hand was empty. The disc was gone. The next week, they let me go back to my studies. The strange thing was, they couldn't find anything different about my DNA anymore. They couldn't understand it. They looked at my DNA many more times, but now there was nothing unusual about it. After a while, they said it was all a mistake. Anyway, they let me get back to my flat and my friends. And the disc? They said it wasn't really old or unusual after all. Really, the disc was nothing more than a CD. It was a mistake, and they were sorry. But it was best for me not to tell anyone at all. Didn't I think that was best? Maybe I did. I never said anything about the disc to Professor Selkirk again. I didn't really know what to say to him, but I knew the disc was real. Was it from some other world? Was another world trying to say something to us? I was sure of it. Maybe the disc saw how angry I was. Perhaps it knew this was not the right time to talk to us. Yes, there was a mistake. But was it our mistake or not? You tell me.